There's a moment, somewhere between the third day of a blizzard and the fourth, when a man stops believing the storm will ever end. I've watched men crack in that silence. Big men. Men who'd wrestled steers and buried wives and rebuilt barns from ash. The cold doesn't care about any of that. It finds the soft place in you, the part you protected your whole life, and it presses there, slow and patient, like a thumb into dough. Cael Briggs was not a big man in the way people mean when they say it admiringly. He was lean and weathered, and owed 3 months of back payments on 40 acres of frozen nothing in the eastern Wyoming territory. He had $14 and a coffee tin of dried beans, and a horse that had stopped trusting him after a bad winter 2 years prior. He was the kind of man who slipped through the world without leaving much of a mark, and he knew it, and mostly he was at peace with that fact. He was not at peace with the donkey. The donkey appeared on the second evening of what would become the Blizzard of January 1887, a storm that would later be written into the historical record as the Big Die-Up, the winter that killed 60% of the cattle on the northern plains and ended more ranching dynasties than debt ever could. But Cael didn't know that yet. He only knew that something was standing in his doorway, half buried in snow, and it was looking at him with eyes so dark and ancient they seemed to contain the specific memory of every cold thing that had ever happened to anything alive. He didn't want to let it in. He did anyway. What happened after that, what that animal cost him, what it gave back, and what it quietly refused to return is the story I've been trying to write down correctly for 37 years. I'm not sure I can do it now, but I've stopped pretending that's a reason not to try. My name is Edgar Home, and I keep a logbook. I started the habit when I was 19 and riding dispatch between the rail camp at Cheyenne and the homestead clusters scattered along the Laramie River. Back then I wrote down distances, weather conditions, which passes were closed and which ferries were running. Practical information. The kind that kept you alive or got you killed depending on whether you'd written it down honestly. Over time, the logbook changed. I started noting things that had no practical value at all. The way a particular woman in Rawlins always stepped outside to watch me leave, though she'd never once spoken to me. The expression on a soldier's face at Fort Fetterman the morning he learned his enlistment had been extended by 8 months. The sound a river makes in November when it's almost, but not quite, frozen solid, that low grinding complaint, like something enormous trying to sleep and failing. I wrote those things down because I didn't know where else to put them. I was 31 years old in January of 1887, and I was 3 days into what should have been a 2-day ride from Casper to a ranch called Flat Creek Station, when the storm closed down on me like a hand. I'd been following a dry creek bed southeast, which is the kind of decision that sounds reasonable when the sky is merely gray, and starts sounding catastrophic around the time visibility drops to 8 feet. By the time I found the Briggs property, if found is the right word for a process that involved riding in what I believed was a straight line for 4 hours, and arriving somewhere I could not identify. The temperature had dropped so far below zero that I'd stopped being able to feel my left ear, and had begun a quiet internal negotiation with the possibility that I might not see another morning. The cabin was small and dark-windowed, and I almost missed it. My horse, a red roan named Constance who had developed, over 7 years of service, a manner of expressing disapproval that could only be described as aristocratic, stopped moving forward about 40 yards from the structure and refused, with tremendous dignity, to continue. I dismounted and led her by the reins the rest of the way. There was a light inside, faint like a lantern turned low, but enough. I knocked. The door opened, and a man looked at me with the specific expression of someone who had been expecting a problem, and was mildly disappointed that the problem had arrived in human form. "Your horse looks like she's been dragged through Judgment Day," he said. "She has her opinions," I said. "I'm sorry to impose. I'm caught in this weather, and I need." "I know what you need." He stepped back. "Come in before you die on my porch. I've got nowhere to bury you and the ground's too frozen besides." That was Cael Briggs. The interior of the cabin was 16 feet by 12, which I know because I measured it later, out of the habit of recording dimensions. There was a wood stove in the northwest corner that was working very hard. There was a table with 1 chair and 1 3-legged stool. There was a rope-strung cot along the east wall with a blanket that had been mended so many times it had become essentially a different blanket from whatever it had originally been. There were 2 shelves above the stove holding food stores: dried beans, a small sack of flour, a tin of salt pork, 2 onions that had seen better decades. There was a coffee tin he used for everything, measuring beans, holding nails, acting as a second cup when company arrived, which I gathered was not often. On the floor in the corner opposite the stove, in a nest of old feed sacking and what appeared to be Cael's second coat, was the donkey. I stopped inside the door and looked at it for a long moment. "Is that?" "Yes," Cael said. "Inside your—" "Yes. Is it?" "Alive," he said, "barely when I found her, better now." He handed me a cup of something hot. Coffee that had been stretched so thin with water that it was more of a philosophical statement about coffee than coffee itself. But I held it with both hands and was grateful in a way that goes beyond words. "Showed up yesterday evening, just standing at my door like she'd been sent." I looked at the donkey. She was a jenny, a female, small even for her kind, with a coat the color of old iron and ears that seemed slightly too large for her skull, which gave her a permanently astonished expression. She was watching me with those dark, measuring eyes, not afraid, not grateful exactly. More the way a very old person watches a stranger enter a room, cataloging, assessing, reserving judgment. "Where'd she come from?" I asked. "Don't know," Cael said. "No brand I can read. Frost got to her ears something fierce. Don't know if she'll keep them." He said it without particular emotion, the way men in that country talked about bad things, stating facts at arm's length so the facts couldn't get too close. "Been warming her up slow, can't do it fast or the blood moves wrong." I sat on the stool and drank my thin coffee and looked at this man who had brought a near-frozen donkey inside his 16-by-12 cabin in the middle of the worst blizzard in a generation, and I tried to figure out what to make of him. He wasn't sentimental, that much was clear immediately. There was no softness in the way he moved around the animal, no cooing or petting or the sort of performative tenderness that people sometimes use with animals as a way of showing other people how tender they are. He checked her ears with the business-like efficiency of a man who had learned animal husbandry not from books but from watching things die when he didn't do it right. He adjusted the feed sacking around her barrel without ceremony. He spoke to her once, flat and direct. "You're not dead yet. Don't start." She didn't blink. He sat across from me and we spent a time not talking, which is a different thing from silence. Silence is absence. Not talking is 2 people deciding, independently, that words would cost more than they were worth in that particular moment. Outside, the storm moved through its registers. Low moan, high whistle, the sound of something, a piece of the lean-to maybe, tearing free and spinning away. The stove popped and breathed. "You work the territory?" he asked eventually. "Dispatch," I said. "Or I was. Rail contract ended. I've been picking up what I can find." He nodded. He looked at his hands, which were cracked along every knuckle and stained with things I couldn't identify and probably didn't need to. "Not much to find this winter." "No," I agreed. "Cattle's dying." He said it the same way he'd said everything else, flat, factual, careful. "Drove through the Hooper place 2 weeks back, lost 40 head in one night when the temperature dropped. Hooper stood in his field and counted them." Just stood there counting. I wrote that down later. The image of Hooper counting dead cattle in a frozen field. I don't know why. It seemed like something that needed to be held somewhere outside a single human head. "You have cattle?" I asked. "Had," Cael said. "Sold the last 4 in October. Couldn't carry them through." A pause. Good call, as it turned out. He got up and added wood to the stove. Checked the donkey's ears again. The jenny turned her large, dark eyes toward him in that measuring way she had, and something passed between them. I don't know what to call it. Not affection. Something more basic. The acknowledgement of shared survival, maybe. The recognition that each of them was keeping the other one in the world by the simple act of being in the same room. I wrote that down too, eventually. It took me years to find the right words for it, and I'm still not sure I have them. The storm ran hard all through that first night and into the following morning. I slept on the floor near the stove, rolled in my own saddle blanket, and woke twice to the sound of the wind changing pitch in a way that suggested the world outside was being rearranged. Each time I opened my eyes, Cael was already awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, or standing at the window scraping ice from the inside glass with his thumbnail so he could look out at nothing, or crouched beside the jenny with his hand flat against her side, measuring her breathing. He didn't sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch. I started keeping track. The second morning, which I knew was morning only because the quality of the darkness changed, shifted from absolute to merely profound. He made a small pot of beans with some of the salt pork and divided it into 2 bowls and set a flat piece of the remaining bread beside each bowl, and we ate without discussion. The Jenny got a portion of the dried grass he'd brought in from the lean-to and a battered tin pail of melted snow. "She's warming," he said. It wasn't directed at me particularly, maybe at himself, maybe at the Jenny. Ears are still a question. I looked at her ears. The tips had darkened in a way I recognized, the color of frostbite settling in, that grayish purple that means tissue deciding whether it will live or surrender. There was a thin line of demarcation, maybe 2 inches from the tip of each ear where the darkness began. She seemed unbothered by them. Maybe she couldn't feel them. That thought, for reasons I can't fully explain, was harder to sit with than the alternative. "What happens if she loses them?" I asked. "She loses them," Cael said. I looked at him. "She'll live without ears," he said. "Ugly but living." He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "Lose the ears or lose the animal. Can't negotiate with cold." I asked him how long he'd been on the property. He thought about it, which surprised me. Usually men know to the month how long they've been on a piece of land, because land tenure in that territory was measured in threats and payments and legal contests, and they tended to track it carefully. 4 years, he said. Going on 5. He paused. Bought it from a man named Ashworth who told me the grazing was good. It is in a wet year. This isn't a wet year. Have you had any wet years? He looked at me sideways. One, he said, partial. Outside, something large shifted, a snow accumulation releasing from the roof on the north side, I thought, and the cabin shuddered slightly. The Jenny's ears pricked, or tried to. One moved more freely than the other. I watched her process the sound and decide it was not a threat and returned to her methodical investigation of the feed sacking around her feet. She nipped at a loose piece of burlap. Let it go. Nipped again. She had, I was beginning to notice, an extremely purposeful relationship with boredom. "What are you going to do with her?" I asked, "when the storm breaks?" Cael was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. He was looking at the Jenny with an expression I couldn't name, not tenderness, not calculation exactly, but something hovering between them. The look of a man doing arithmetic in his head that he doesn't entirely want to do. "Don't know yet," he said. That was the first lie he told me, I think. Or maybe not a lie, maybe he genuinely didn't know. But there was something in the way he said it, the slight compression of the syllables, that made me write it down later with a small question mark beside it in my logbook. Don't know yet. He knew, he just hadn't decided if he was willing to admit it yet. By the second afternoon, the storm had not broken, but had settled into something more sustainable, still blowing hard, still cold enough to kill, but no longer the shrieking catastrophic fury of the previous night. The kind of blizzard that intends to outlast you rather than overwhelm you. The kind you have to wait out, which is in some ways harder. Cael spent the afternoon repairing a piece of tack, a cracked bit of harness leather that he worked over with an awl and a curved needle with the focused patience of a man who has learned to occupy himself or go quietly mad. I offered to help, and he handed me the needle and watched me for about 40 seconds before taking it back without comment. I am not skilled with an awl. We talked in that discontinuous way that becomes possible after enough shared hours in a small space. Not conversation. Conversation implies an arc, a point, an exchange of information moving toward something. This was more like 2 people thinking out loud and occasionally responding to each other. He told me about the winter 2 years prior, a cold snap in November that had caught him unprepared, killed 2 of his horses, and left him hiking 12 miles to the nearest settlement with frost-bitten toes that still gave him trouble in the mornings. He told me about it without self-pity, which is a harder thing to achieve than it sounds. Self-pity is the easiest emotion in the world to fall into when you're describing genuine suffering, and resisting it takes either tremendous character or tremendous pride, and I wasn't yet sure which one was operating in Cael Briggs. I told him about a storm I'd ridden through in my 2nd year of dispatch work. Not as severe as this one, but worse in some ways because I'd been alone and hadn't known enough to be frightened at the right moments. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality I appreciated because it was rarer than it should have been. The Jenny slept, or appeared to sleep, She had a way of standing with her eyes three-quarters closed that might have been sleep or might have been something else. Rest, maybe. Contemplation. The donkey version of keeping a logbook. Late in the afternoon, around the time the light through the ice-filmed window went from pale gray to dark gray to nothing, I asked him the question that had been sitting in my mind since I'd arrived. "Why didn't you leave her outside?" He looked up from the harness. "The donkey," I said. "You didn't have to bring her in. She showed up at your door and you could have." "She would have died," he said. "Yes. So?" I wasn't sure how to respond to that. It seemed like a complete answer and simultaneously no answer at all. He looked back at the harness, worked the needle through a tight seam. "I found a man frozen in a ditch once," he said. "East side of the Powder River, maybe 12 years back. Drunk, fell off his horse, couldn't get up. I was maybe a quarter mile past him before I stopped." I waited. "I almost kept going," he said. "It was cold, I was tired, I didn't know him, I'd lost a day already and I had supplies waiting." He tested the seam. "Almost kept going." "But you didn't." "No," he didn't look up. "But I almost did. And the almost, that's the part that stays with you, not what you did, what you almost did." He said it the same way he said everything, flat, factual. But something moved underneath it, something with weight. The Jenny chose that moment to shake herself awake, her whole body vibrating from skin outward, her oversized ears swinging. She looked at Cael. He didn't look at her. But one corner of his mouth changed, almost imperceptibly, in a direction that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I wrote that down. The almost smile, the almost kept going. A man who did the right thing, but needed to remember the almost to keep himself honest about what it cost. The storm that night was quieter. Still hard, still cold, but the screaming pitch had gone out of it. We slept, both of us, for the first time, in something closer to actual intervals of unconsciousness, rather than the half-alert, half-sleep of the previous night. I woke once, around what must have been 3 or 4 in the morning by the depth of the dark, and found the Jenny standing over me. She had crossed the cabin while I slept, apparently finding the feed sacking insufficient, and was now regarding me from a distance of approximately 8 inches with those ancient dark eyes. Her breath was warm and smelled of dried grass, and something earthier underneath. I lay very still. She lowered her nose and investigated my shoulder, my collar, the side of my face with a careful precision that felt almost clinical. Then she exhaled one long, slow breath and moved back to her corner. I lay there for a while after that, not sleeping, listening to the changed sound of the wind and the stove's breathing and the Jenny's steady exhalations in the corner. I opened my logbook and wrote, by the faint red glow through the stove grate. She knows exactly what she's doing, whatever she's doing. I wasn't sure what I meant by that. I'm still not sure 37 years later. On the 3rd morning, Cael found the beans were running low. He didn't tell me directly. I watched him measure the dried beans into the pot with a slowness and precision that was its own kind of communication, the careful economy of a man rationing. We had enough for 2 more days, maybe 3 if we were careful. The storm, by his estimation, could run another 4 or 5. He'd been through enough of them to read the sky's intentions, and the sky's intentions were not good. He stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the white nothing. "There's a supply cache," he said. 2 miles east, old homestead abandoned. I kept some stores there case I couldn't get to town in a bad stretch." I said nothing. "It's a bad stretch," he said. 2 miles in this?" I said. 2 miles, he said, not arguing, just stating the distance. I looked at Constance in the lean-to. She was visible through the cabin's single east-facing window, standing in the covered structure he'd built against the cabin's exterior, alive and miserable and deeply aristocratic about it. My horse. My means of, theoretically, surviving this. "I'll go," I said. "I know the land," he said. "You know the animal better," I said. "If her ears go bad while you're gone." He looked at me. This seemed to land somewhere. He looked at the Jenny. He looked back at me. "Northwest," he said. "Old cottonwood stand marks the turn. Low ridge cache is in the root cellar of the standing wall. Lift the floor, there's a board, under the board." "I'll find it," I said. I almost didn't. But that part comes later. That day, the 3rd day, the rationing day, is the day I've thought about most over the years, because it was the day I started to understand what I was actually watching in that cabin. Not a man caring for an animal, something more complicated than that. Something that had to do with the almost, and the not quite, and the thin, cold line between who you are and who you almost became. I'll tell it as well as I'm able. Which is not perfectly. But then, nothing in that storm was. The day I went out into the blizzard for Cael Briggs's supply cache, I was wearing everything I owned. 2 pairs of wool socks. My boots, good ones, bought in Cheyenne the previous spring, resoled once since. My heaviest coat over my second heaviest coat, which created a layered effect that was thermally sensible, but made it nearly impossible to turn my head more than 15 degrees in either direction. My hat tied down with a length of rope Cael had cut for me. My gloves, leather outside, wool inside, and a second pair of wool gloves beneath those, because the outer ones had cracked at the index finger of my right hand in a way that let cold in at exactly the wrong angle. Cael stood in the doorway as I led Constance out of the lean-to. His expression was the expression of a man who has offered and accepted something at the same time, a cost-benefit transaction that neither person is entirely comfortable with, but both understand to be necessary. 2 miles, he said again. I heard you the first time, I said. Northwest, he said. The cottonwood stand looks like 4 trees, but there's a 5th buried in the draw. That's your turn marker. The 5th tree. Don't miss the 5th tree. I mounted Constance, who expressed her opinion of the situation through her posture alone, the equine version of a sigh that involves the whole body. I pointed her northwest. I want to be precise about what it is to ride through a blizzard, because it's one of those experiences that sounds dramatic but feels, for most of its duration, like something much duller and more absolute. It doesn't feel like an adventure. It feels like the absence of everything. Sound, color, dimension. The storm flattens all of it into a uniform white pressure that pushes against you from every direction simultaneously, so that after 10 minutes you lose the sense of moving through space and begin to feel instead like something fixed and small that space is moving against. What you do riding in a blizzard is focus on the small things. The angle of the wind on your left cheek, which tells you something about direction if you've been tracking it. The way your horse's ears move, Constance's, turned back slightly and then forward, reading things I couldn't see. The texture of the snow underfoot, which in open country is different from the snow near terrain features in ways that take years to learn to read, and which I read imperfectly. I counted, not to measure time, but to give my mind something to do besides spiral. Counted Constance's steps, counted the gusts, counted the number of times I shifted my weight to check my balance against the wind. At roughly 400 steps, I almost turned back. Not because I was afraid, or not only because of that. Because I genuinely could not see the cottonwood stand, could not see anything that suggested a specific direction was better than any other, and the snow had gotten into the one cracked finger of my glove, and my right hand was starting to hurt in the slow, specific way that means the hurt is going to get much worse before it gets better. I stopped. Constance stopped. I sat in the white nothing and tried to remember what Cael had told me about the land. The creek bed, you'd feel the ground drop before you saw it. The ridge, it came up slow, almost imperceptible. The cottonwood stand, 4 trees visible, 5th buried in the draw. The draw. If there was a draw, there'd be a wind shadow on the lee side. Even in this storm, even this small, a draw would deflect the worst of the nor-northwest gusts slightly east. I turned Constance a few degrees into what I thought was east and rode. 6 minutes later, I know because I was counting, the wind shifted against my right cheek instead of my left, and the snow changed lighter, and through the lighter snow I saw the shapes. 4 dark columns, wind-stripped of most of their branches but unmistakably cottonwood trunks, and slightly lower, slightly to the right, a 5th shape half buried in drifted white. I exhaled. My breath froze immediately against my collar. Good girl, I said to Constance, who had done nothing in particular except not die, which I supposed was sufficient. The cache was where Cael had described it, in the root cellar of the standing wall, which was all that remained of an old soddy, 3 walls and a half-collapsed roof, and a floor with a board lifted by a specific technique involving the heel of your boot and a particular angle of pressure. I figured it out after 3 attempts. Underneath, 6 pounds of dried beans in a sealed tin, a smaller tin of salt, A cloth sack with 4 cured sausages, frozen solid but intact. A bottle of something amber whiskey, as it turned out, a half-inch of it left and wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the cache, a photograph. I didn't mean to look at it. I was unwrapping the cloth to see if there was anything else stored underneath, and the photograph fell out and landed face up in the snow. It was a formal portrait, studio-made, the kind that was fashionable in the 1870s and 80s, the person seated rigidly with the elaborate backdrop, and the carefully composed expression that always looks slightly like someone pretending not to be terrified. A woman, maybe 30, with dark hair parted severely, and hands folded in her lap and eyes that, even in the stiff formality of a studio portrait, had something warm in them that the camera had caught despite itself. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I wrapped it back carefully in the cloth and put it in my coat pocket inside, where the cold couldn't reach it, and I loaded everything else into my saddlebag and remounted Constance and turned back toward the cabin. I didn't know, going back, whose photograph it was. I had a feeling, though. The kind of feeling that doesn't come from evidence so much as from the accumulated weight of small observations. The single chair and single cot. The way Cael said instead of we for everything related to the property. The cache itself, stored 2 miles away in a place no one would accidentally find, like something hidden against a future when you might need it in a hurry, or against a past you were trying to keep at a certain distance. The return trip was faster. The wind was at my back now, or mostly, and Constance had found her footing. I got turned around once, briefly, before the land dropped toward the creek in the way Cael had described, and I recognized the feel of the terrain and corrected. I came back into view of the cabin from slightly north of the angle I'd left on, so that I saw the Linta first, and Constance saw it before I did. Her pace changed. That slight gathering of purpose that horses show when they recognize destination. Cael opened the door before I'd finished tying Constance. He looked at me, then at the saddlebag. "Got everything," I said. He nodded. Something moved through his face, not relief exactly. A relaxation of something that had been held tight. He stepped back, and I came in and stood by the stove and felt my body remember what warmth was and resented how far away it had seemed for the last 2 hours. The Jenny was standing. She'd been lying down when I left, and the fact of her standing seemed significant. "She better," I said. "Moving more," he said. He was already unpacking the saddlebag onto the table, taking inventory with the efficient hands of a man who has done without enough to know exactly what having enough means. I took the photograph out of my coat pocket. I'd thought on the ride back about whether to show it to him. It was his property, had to be, stored in his cache. But the way I'd found it, wrapped separate from the food stores, put there deliberately, there was something about it that felt private in a way that food stores don't. You store beans to use them. You store a photograph wrapped in cloth in a root cellar 2 miles from your cabin for a different kind of reason. But carrying it home and not saying anything seemed wrong too. I set it on the table beside the beans. He went still. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it for a moment, the cloth, the shape of what was inside, and then looked at me, and the look was not anger but something adjacent. A question: how did you know to treat it carefully? I didn't say anything. He picked it up, unwrapped it, looked at the photograph for a long moment. "My wife," he said, then a second later, "my late wife." "I'm sorry," I said. He folded the cloth back over the portrait. 3 years ago," he said. "Fever." He set it down on the shelf above the stove, face up, the first time it had been anywhere but wrapped in cloth and hidden away since I'd found it. Then he turned back to the beans and didn't say anything else about it. I sat on the stool. The Jenny investigated my boot with her nose. I let her. The storm pressed against the walls. The stove breathed. Outside, something enormous and indifferent continued rearranging the world. I wrote nothing for a while. There are moments that resist the logbook impulse, moments where the act of notation feels like diminishment, like pressing a flower into paper. The flower was better alive and impermanent than preserved and flat. Eventually, I wrote, "He's not keeping the photograph hidden because he's ashamed of it. He's keeping it where it can't break him on an ordinary Tuesday." Then I crossed that out because it was too much interpretation. I wrote instead, "She's on the shelf now." 3 words sufficient. We ate that evening with more generosity than we'd eaten the previous 2 days, the sausages thawed and fried in the pan with onion, the beans not rationed but filled out. Cael made the coffee stronger. Not strong, but noticeably less philosophical than the previous batches. The Jenny ate her grass and observed the meal with the expression of an old philosopher watching young people enjoy something she has long since transcended. We talked more that night. Not about his wife, he didn't return to it, and I didn't ask, and that arrangement felt correct. We talked about the territory, about the cattle situation, about what the spring would look like after a winter this bad. He knew a great deal about the land. He'd read it carefully over 4 years of depending on it, and he spoke about its particulars. The draw that flooded every 3rd year, the south pasture that kept green 2 weeks later than it should, the specific behavior of the creek in spring melt, with the intimacy of someone who has studied a difficult text, until they understand not just what it says, but why. It's good land, he said, not defensively, just honestly. But, I said. He turned his cup in his hands. Not enough of it, he said, and he stopped, started again. I'm one man. I heard what he was and wasn't saying in that sentence. One man where there had been plans for more than one. One man doing the arithmetic of a future that had been designed with different inputs. The property, the cash 2 miles away. The chair and the stool and the single cot. The photograph on the shelf. The donkey, I said, not connecting it to anything, just naming it. He looked at me sideways. She showed up, I said. Yes, he said. Company, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I haven't decided what to do with her. I know, I said. And I did know by then. I knew that the uncertainty wasn't practical. He'd already decided on some level what the practical answer was. The Jenny was a working animal in a region that used working animals, and a man who was struggling financially and alone on 40 acres of difficult land had very clear options when a sound working animal appeared at his door. He could keep her and use her. He could sell her for whatever the market offered. He could find her original owner, if there was one. All of those were practical answers. None of them were the answer he was sitting with. The answer he was sitting with was the one you arrive at when an animal appears at your door in the worst storm of a generation, and looks at you with eyes that contain the specific weight of every cold thing that has ever happened to anything alive, and you almost close the door, and then you don't. The answer you sit with then isn't practical. It's the one where you're trying to figure out what the almost means about you, and what the not quite means about who you could still become. That night, around midnight, the Jenny began to show distress. I don't know what woke me, a change in her breathing, maybe, or the sound of her shifting in the feed, sacking with a frequency that was different from her usual restlessness. I opened my eyes, and she was standing, and her weight was moving from foot to foot in a slow, rocking motion that I had not seen her do before. I sat up. Cael was already awake. He was crouched beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his face close to hers. What is it? I said. Don't know yet. He was checking her hooves, her legs, working up toward her body with that same business-like efficiency. Then he found her belly, the left side, and his hand stopped. He pressed carefully. The Jenny flinched. She's colicking, he said. Colic in a horse or donkey in winter, in a small cabin, with limited resources and no veterinarian within accessible distance. I knew enough to know that was serious. Colic is a general term for abdominal pain, but in equines it ranges from the manageable to the rapidly fatal, and what you do about it in the first hours matters enormously. What do you need? I said. She needs to move, he said. Can't let her go down and roll. She does that, she could twist. He didn't finish the sentence. He looked at the 16x12 walls. He looked at me. We walked her. That's the only way to describe it. For 4 hours in a 16x12 cabin, with a storm running full force outside, and a stove we had to keep feeding and furniture we pushed to the walls to make a circuit, we walked her. Cael in front with his hand on her halter. Me behind, guiding her hindquarters, making sure she didn't try to go down. A slow oval track. Stove corner to door wall to cot wall to shelf wall, back. It was absurd. Physically absurd. The Jenny was 4 feet at the shoulder, and I am 5'9", and the clearance between her back and the cabin's low rafter was maybe 8 inches. Cael is taller than me, and he spent half the circuit slightly hunched. She knocked the stool over twice. She investigated the shelf with her nose on each pass, and tried to eat one of Cael's spare bootlaces, which he removed from her reach without slowing down. We didn't talk much. There wasn't room for it in any sense. We focused on the circuit, The oval. The keeping moving, that was the only thing we could offer her. Around the second hour, maybe 2 in the morning, she stopped at the door wall and stood with her head low and her eyes half closed. And for one long, suspended moment, I thought she was going down. I pressed my palm against her flank, ready to push, and looked at Cael. He put his forehead against her cheek, just for a second, his eyes closed. She exhaled long, slow, and lifted her head and walked on. By 4 in the morning, the character of her distress had changed. The foot rocking had stopped. Her ears, both of them, even the damaged one, were moving independently, tracking sounds. Her interest in the boot lace returned. These, Cael told me, were good signs. By 5, she was eating. We sat on the floor, both of us, too tired for the cot and the stool, just down against the wall, and watched her eat and didn't say anything for a long time. "Close," I said eventually. "Yes," he said. He had his head back against the wall and his eyes half closed, and in the faint light of the stove grate I could see that his hands were shaking slightly. Not with cold, with the release of tension, the physical aftermath of sustained fear. I looked at the photograph on the shelf, the woman with the warm eyes. I looked at Cael. I thought about 4 hours of walking an oval in a too-small cabin, forehead to cheek in the almost dark. I didn't write anything down, not then. Later, much later, I wrote, he didn't ask what she was worth, he only asked what she needed. The storm outside was quieter. The Jenny ate. Cael Briggs slept sitting up against the wall, finally, between the stove and the shelf, where his wife's portrait looked out at nothing in particular, and his hands stopped shaking, and the morning, distant but approaching, began its slow work of becoming real. Not all at once, storms don't end, they relent. They lose interest in stages. First, the wind dropped from its highest register to something merely brutal. Then brutal became sustained. Then sustained became intermittent. By afternoon, the sky in the west had turned a color that was almost blue, and by evening there were stars, hard and cold and indifferent as always, but visible, present. I stood outside the cabin for the first time in 4 days and looked at the sky and felt something complicated. Relief and its shadow simultaneously. The sense that the danger was over, and the sense that the intensity of those 5 days was over too, and those two things exist in a person at the same time and don't fully resolve. The land was changed. That's the word I kept arriving at. Changed. The drifts had rearranged the topography. What had been a slight rise to the south was now an 8-foot wall. The lean-to had held, barely. One of its support posts had been pushed inward, and the roof sat at a new angle that would need immediate attention. The fence line that Cael had pointed out to me on the first night, visible through the east window, what I'd taken for a rough property boundary, had largely disappeared under the snow. He came out after me and stood beside me and looked at it. "Well," he said. "Yes," I said. Constance, from inside the lean-to, made a sound that expressed opinions about all of it. We did the work that needed doing, the immediate work, the survival work, shoveled a path to the lean-to, checked the post and braced it temporarily with what we had available. Got Constance outside long enough to assess her, cold, stiff, deeply unimpressed with everything but sound, and back in. The Jenny came out on her own, stepping through the newly shoveled path with her characteristic purposeful deliberateness, investigating the changed world with her nose, one ear tracking right and one tracking left. Her ear tips had darkened further. There was no question now about what would happen. Cael examined them without drama, the way a doctor reads a chart when the diagnosis is confirmed and the only remaining question is management. "She'll lose about an inch," he said. "1.5 both sides." "You're going to have to take them," I said. "Tomorrow," he said. "She's too tired today, and so am I." We went back inside. He built the fire up, and we ate the last of the sausage and the remainder of the beans, and he opened the last half-inch of the amber whiskey and poured it equally between the 2 cups, which was not quite enough to be felt, but was exactly enough to mark the occasion of surviving. "You're heading out tomorrow," he said, not a question. "When the light's good," I said. "Yes." He nodded. He turned the cup in his hands. "You could stay another day. Ground's going to be rough." "I know," I said. "I need to go." He nodded again. He looked at the Jenny, who had returned to her corner and was engaged with a piece of burlap in the methodical way she engaged with everything. "What will you do," I asked, "with her?" He was quiet for a moment. Then keep her. He said it differently than he'd said don't know yet on the first night. That had been a closed door, deliberately closed, so he didn't have to look at what was on the other side. This was different. This was the door open, the thing on the other side named. She needs a name, I said. He almost smiled, the same corner of the mouth phenomenon I'd observed on the first day. She already has one, he said. I waited. She told me, he said, which was the most words I'd heard him apply to anything resembling humor. It's January. I looked at the Jenny. January looked back at me with those ancient dark measuring eyes and nipped at the burlap and was unimpressed. January, I said. It's what month it is, he said, as if that settled it. Which I suppose it did. I spent that last evening doing something I hadn't done since arriving. I sat at the table and wrote properly in my logbook. Not fragments. Not field notes. A proper accounting, because I felt, sitting in that cabin on the evening after the storm, that what had happened in the previous 5 days was something I did not want to misremember or compress or allow to smooth itself into generality. So I wrote the specifics, the dimensions of the cabin, the exact color of the Jenny's eyes, the almost smile, the 4 hours of walking the oval, the way he'd put his forehead against her cheek, the photograph on the shelf and the way he'd placed it there, face up, present, no longer hidden. I wrote, he's been alone with a grief that has no practical resolution. He has been managing it by making it small, by keeping it in a cloth 2 miles away where it can't break him on an ordinary Tuesday. I wrote the storm brought the photograph inside. The storm brought January. I don't know what I meant by the second sentence exactly. Or I do, but I'm not sure I can explain it without making it sound like a tidy lesson, which it wasn't. It was more complicated than that. It was a man who had been contracting for 3 years, contracting his world, reducing his exposure, putting things he couldn't afford to feel at a deliberate distance. And then a storm came that removed the option of distance. For 5 days he could not manage his grief at arm's length. For 5 days the photograph was on the shelf. For 5 days the Jenny needed everything he had. And what I'd watched, I think, was the specific moment when a person stops managing grief and starts just carrying it. The transition from keeping it contained to letting it be present, which sounds simple, which is the hardest thing there is. He read over my shoulder for a moment. I didn't hear him approach, which was a thing I'd noticed about him. He moved quietly and then stepped back. You write everything down, he said. Yes, I said. Why? I thought about the honest answer, which took a moment to locate. Because I'm not sure what's important yet, I said, and I don't want to lose it before I figure it out. He was quiet, then, you think this is important? I think you are, I said. What you did in the storm, I think it's, I stopped. I don't know the right word yet. I kept a donkey alive, he said, not dismissive, just precise. Yes, I said, that's the part I don't have the right word for yet. He went to bed. I wrote for another hour. In the morning, he took the Jenny's ears. I want to record this carefully, because it is the moment in those 5 days that I have returned to most often in my mind, and the moment I've gotten wrong the most times in the various drafts of this account, sometimes making it too dramatic, sometimes making it too small. It wasn't dramatic, it was quiet and cold, and it took 12 minutes. He had a blade he'd sterilized in the flame. He had strips of clean cloth. He had a bottle of diluted carbolic acid that he'd been carrying in his kit since the previous autumn. I hadn't seen it until now, which meant he'd had it all along, and had been waiting for the moment when it was needed. The care of a man who anticipates. He worked slowly. He talked to her throughout, not cooing, not sweetness, but a low, continuous murmur, steady and monotone, the way you'd read someone a very boring text to help them sleep. It wasn't comfort exactly. It was a frequency, a presence, something to locate herself relative to while the rest of experience was difficult. She flinched twice. The first time was expected. The second time, the left ear, which had more damage and required more. She turned her head sharply toward him, and he held her halter with his free hand, and she looked at him for a long moment, and then turned back and was still. He wrapped both ears precisely, tied the cloth in a way that would hold without pressure points, checked her legs, her breathing, her color. Then he stepped back. January shook her body, that full-body shimmer from skin outward, and looked at him with her ancient eyes, and then turned and investigated the corner of the cabin where the burlap was. He exhaled. I wrote, the ear tips on the floor. A thimble's worth of something she didn't need anymore and won't miss. I wrote, he looked at her like she'd done something remarkable by surviving what had been done to her. And maybe she had. I left at 9 in the morning. The sky was clear and hard, and the temperature was deeply below zero but with no wind, which made it manageable in a way that wind doesn't allow. Constance was eager, or her version of eager, which involved a kind of pointed directional decisiveness, like a woman with a destination and strong opinions about efficiency. Cael walked me to the edge of where the shoveled path ended and the untracked snow began. He handed me a piece of the remaining dried beef wrapped in cloth for the ride. "Eastern pass'll be clearer than the south," he said. "Wind came from the northwest, stacks deeper on the south approach." "I know," I said. "I know you know," he said, saying it anyway. I looked at him. He looked at the middle distance, that habit of his, looking slightly past the person he was talking to, as if the world in the immediate vicinity was too close to see clearly. "I'm going to write about this," I said, "about you." He shrugged slightly. "Write about January," he said. "I'll write about both." He almost smiled, the almost. I turned Constance east and rode. What I've been trying to write, in the 37 drafts and partial drafts and abandoned attempts of the intervening years, is not the story of the storm. The storm is just weather. Extreme weather, historically significant weather, weather that killed thousands of cattle and ended dozens of ranching operations across the northern plains. But weather. The newspaper accounts have the weather. What I've been trying to write is smaller than that, and larger than that simultaneously. I've been trying to write the 17 seconds, I'm guessing at the duration. I wasn't counting then. Between the moment Cael Briggs opened his door on the second evening of the blizzard and saw a near-frozen Jenny standing in the snow, and the moment he stepped back and let her in. Because something happened in those 17 seconds. Some negotiation between the man he'd been managing to be and the man he actually was. Between the cabin he'd built at careful distance from everything that could hurt him and the photograph he'd stored 2 miles away wrapped in cloth. Between the almost kept going and the not quite. He didn't keep going. He let her in. And then, and this is the part I wrote 100 ways before I understood it, she stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go. I've thought about that, and I don't think it's true. A Jenny who survived whatever she survived before she reached his door, who navigated through the worst blizzard in a generation, who walked a 16-by-12 oval for 4 hours without going down, and who looked at the man who cut her ears and then turned back to the burlap. That is not an animal without resources. She stayed because she chose, in whatever way animals make choices to stay. She stayed because the room was warm. Not just thermally warm. Warm in the way a place becomes when someone in it decides, against the easier option, to care about something. I heard from Cael once more. A letter forwarded through a mutual contact in Casper, a land agent I'd done business with who knew us both. This was in 1889, 2 years after the blizzard. The letter was 4 sentences. The spring came late, but the grass is good. I put in a small vegetable garden on the south side this year, first time I've done that. January had a foal in April. I haven't named it yet. That's all he wrote. I read it 4 times. I wrote back, I asked how they were, all of them. I asked if the foal was a Jenny or a Jack. I asked if he'd named it yet, if the vegetable garden had yielded anything, if the winter of 1889 had been manageable. I didn't get a reply. I don't know if he wrote again and the letter was lost, a common enough occurrence in that territory in those years, or if he'd said everything he needed to say in 4 sentences and considered the correspondence concluded. Both are possible. Both feel like him in their own way. What I know is this: he put in a vegetable garden on the south side. First time he'd done that, which means he was planning something or allowing himself to plan something, which is its own kind of motion. The forward-facing orientation of a man who has decided the future is worth cultivating. And January had a foal in April, which means someone else had reached that cabin in the intervening 2 years, reached it and been let in. I'm writing this account in my 68th year, in a room in Laramie that has good light in the morning and a window that looks east over a piece of high country that still, in winter, turns white in ways that remind me of certain specific silences. I have 43 logbooks on the shelf above my desk. I've counted, each one numbered and dated on the spine, a habit from the dispatch days that I've never broken. Volume 12 is the 1887 volume. The Blizzard entries are pages 44 through 61. I've reread them more times than I can count. They're not very dramatic on the page. Field notes, essentially, temperatures, bean rations, cabin dimensions. A drawing I made of the Jenny's face on the third day. I'm not a skilled illustrator, but I caught something in the eyes, I think. Something that even now, looking at my own rough lines, I can recognize as the specific quality I'm trying to describe. Old patient measuring. Not asking for anything. Not offering anything. Just present, just here, deciding in some deep, unspoken way that this was worth staying for. I think about Cael Briggs. I think about where he is now. He'd be in his mid-60s if he survived. Wyoming winters have their opinions about that kind of accounting. I think about the vegetable garden on the south side, the photograph on the shelf. The way January looked at him after her ears came off, briefly, directly, with the specific weight of something transacted and settled, and then turned back to the burlap. I think about the 17 seconds in the doorway. And I think about the small, accumulating argument a life makes for itself, in the choices you make when no one's watching, in the things you keep and the things you finally let inside, in the difference, the essential difference, between the almost and the not quite. He let her in. She stayed. What happened after the blizzard left him speechless isn't a single moment. It's the garden. It's the foal. It's the letter he wrote and the one he may have written after. It's the photograph, face up now, looking at the room. I close volume 12. The sky outside is very blue and very cold, the particular blue of an eastern Wyoming winter that always reminds me of a lantern seen through ice-filmed glass. Faint, remote, insufficient, and somehow sufficient.